In 1900, Argentina was richer than France. By 1950, it was begging for scraps. At the turn of the 20th century, Argentina wasn't a developing nation, it was a destination. Wealthier per capita than Germany, with Buenos Aires rivaling Paris as a cultural capital, Argentina looked like it had cracked the code. Beef, wheat, and wool flowed out. Capital and immigrants flowed in. The incentive structure was crystal clear: extract resources, sell them globally, get rich. So what happened? Why does a nation that held the keys to prosperity end up locked out of its own future? The answer isn't incompetence, it's incentives. Argentina's wealth came from one thing: land, specifically the ability to export agricultural products to Europe at premium prices. Landowners got rich, really rich, and when you get that rich, you don't build factories, you build political power. By the 1920s and 30s, Argentina's landed elite had transformed the country into what economists call a rentier state. The money was too easy to share. Why invest in manufacturing, education, or institutions when you could just own land and collect checks? The incentive to build something permanent, something that required rule of law, transparency, investment in people, was nearly zero. Then came Perón. In 1946, Juan Domingo Perón rode a wave of nationalist fervor into power with a simple pitch: Argentina for Argentines. He nationalized industries, redistributed wealth to workers, and gave the masses what they'd never had before: dignity and a paycheck. The elites hated it. But here's the thing nobody tells you: Perón wasn't wrong about the problem. He was catastrophically wrong about the solution. When you nationalize industries and run them for political gain instead of efficiency, you get the same product at higher cost. When you price control exports to subsidize domestic consumption, you destroy the export market. When you print money to fund promises you can't keep, you get inflation. Perón's policies felt like redistribution. They were actually just wealth destruction with better optics. But Perón left office and died in 1974. Why didn't Argentina course correct? Because the incentive structure had changed. Now the political class had discovered something even better than land wealth: they could borrow from the future. Deficit spending became the national drug, and nobody wanted to be the one to refuse the next hit. The 1980s and 90s saw military coups, hyperinflation that made the peso worthless, and repeated cycles of boom and bust. Each time the government borrowed more. Each time inflation spiked. Each time ordinary Argentines got poorer. The pattern was predictable because the incentives were predictable. Politicians could promise everything today and leave the bill for tomorrow. Then in 2001, it all collapsed. The peso crashed, banks froze deposits, people lost their life savings overnight, riots erupted in the streets. Argentina defaulted on its debt, the largest sovereign default in history at that moment. The nation that had once rivaled the world's richest countries was now begging the IMF for a bailout. What's haunting about Argentina's story is that it's not about stupidity or bad luck. It's about incentives. When your wealth comes from a single resource, land, oil, minerals, the people who control that resource have no incentive to build institutions that would dilute their power. They have every incentive to keep things simple, concentrated, and political. Compare Argentina to Australia. Both had vast agricultural exports in 1900. Both were geographically isolated. But Australia built institutions, transparent courts, property rights, universities, manufacturing bases that created a diversified economy. Australia's leaders had an incentive to build something permanent because no single industry could capture the state. Argentina's landowners never faced that pressure. They were too comfortable, so they didn't build. They extracted, they politicked, they borrowed, and they spent. And when the bill came due, they were gone, a capital had fled, the currency was worthless, and ordinary people paid the price. The recovery after 2001 was real but fragile. Argentina rebuilt, but the underlying problem never went away. The incentive to build institutions remained weaker than the incentive to extract wealth. Each new government promised reform. Each one faced pressure from interest groups, workers, unions, business owners, politicians who benefited from the status quo. Fast forward to today, Argentina's inflation is running at double digits. The peso keeps losing value. Poverty has climbed. The nation still has the resources, the land, the cattle, the minerals, but it never built the institutions to convert those resources into sustainable prosperity. The incentive trap set a century ago is still snapping shut. So why does this matter? Because Argentina's story isn't unique. It's a template. Every resource-rich nation faces the same choice: build institutions or extract wealth. The nations that choose institutions, rule of law, transparent courts, investment in education, tend to prosper. The ones that don't end up like Argentina, rich on paper, broke in practice. Argentina never became a failed state. It never collapsed into civil war or famine. But it did something arguably worse. It stayed just stable enough to keep the same broken system running. The elites kept extracting. The politicians kept spending. The people kept suffering. And the nation that could have been a first world power spent a century proving that wealth without institutions is just a ticking clock. The answer to our original question, why Argentina never became a first world power, isn't a mystery. It's a choice. A choice made by people responding to incentives. A choice to extract rather than build. A choice that echoes across a century and continues to shape the nation's trajectory today. This video is for educational and informational purposes only and is not financial advice. Always do your own research. Subscribe for more stories about how incentives shape nations. There's a new unsolved economic mystery every week. This video is for educational and informational purposes only and is not financial advice. Always do your own research.